In this lecture, we'll be creating a snake and we'll be animating it with a deadly strike. Okay, so to create my snake, I'll use the default cube. I'll scale it down a fair bit to here, to about a third of the size. I'll come to front view and scale it in the X, so it's nice and long like this. So it's about 6 times. And then I'll go into edit mode and I'll select the end face, so 3 to go to face mode, select the end face, E to extrude out. I'll scale that in the Y, and I'll scale it in the Z very slightly, just a little bit, so it's a bit wider at the top there. And E to extrude out, and I'll scale that down. So we've got a sort of snake-looking character here. I'll just grab that out a little bit further there. Okay, so there's our snake. Now, in order for this to deform nicely, we need lots of loop cuts down the middle here. So Control R, and I can do, let's say, 30 cuts this time because it's a little bit longer. So we've got our snake here. Now I need to set up a bone system for it. So I'll go back to object mode, Shift A to add, armature, single bone. Let's go to front view. We'll need to go to the object data properties here, viewport display, and turn on in front so we can see that. Now again, we have that slight debate of whether we want to move it in object mode or edit mode. Now it's slightly helpful to have the object origin at the base of the snake. So I'll move it in object mode. So G, then X. And currently, if I go to the bone, and I'll just quickly turn on the move gizmo, which is set up to be the same as our Cartesian coordinates up here. So that's the global orientation. I'll just quickly switch to local. So that's this object's orientation. And you'll notice it's precisely the same. So this bone currently has precisely the same orientation as the global orientation. So that's something to be aware of. If I go into edit mode, and I'll select the base of my bone, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then select all my bone, change the pivot point to 3D cursor and RY90, and I'll go back into object mode. Now I've still got the local axis selected, and it's the same as the global coordinates in terms of rotation. So that's the advantage of rotating it in edit mode. You keep the orientation of the object to the global orientation. Don't worry if that didn't make complete sense, just bear that in mind for the future. It won't make too much difference to our model at the moment, but it's something to keep in mind. Okay, so back to front view, back to edit mode, and I'll just change my pivot point to bounding box center again, so there's no confusion. And as a reminder, you can bring up that menu with period key on your keyboard. Let's go to the end. And now I could extrude out one blender unit all the way to the end. I'll just quickly show you another way of creating bones. So I've got my tail selected. I can click and drag to the end of my snake, select the bone, right click and subdivide. And I can just up the subdivisions until I've got what I believe is enough bones. Now, if you have loads of bones, it can take a while to animate. But if you have too fewer bones, your animation looks a bit sort of kinked. So for this snake, I'll have 10 bones. So it'll look a little bit crooked, but it will save us time when we animate. So the last thing for me to do is parent my snake to the bones. So I'll go back into edit mode. I'll select my snake. And there's one more tip that I'll show you that's quite important at this stage. If I press N on my keyboard and go to the scale, you can see that this is non-uniform scale. So when I scaled my snake in object mode, it changes the numbers here. When you rig an object, it's good practice to have this scale set to 1. So we're kind of setting this scale. We do this by pressing Control A, or we can actually go up to Object, and that's the Apply menu here, Control A, and we can then set the scale. When I do that, it applies the scale and sets it to 1. It's not always the case, but that can cause problems when you are parenting your mesh to your bones. So with my snake selected, I can now select my bones and Control P, set parent to with automatic weights. Then we can test this out by pressing Control Tab to go into pose mode. Notice you can do this with your snake mesh selected as well. It doesn't matter. And I can test this rig and see if it's worked okay. And it's looking good. Like I say, it's a little bit crooked in places, but that's fine. Okay, so I'll select all with A and Alt R and Alt G just in case I accidentally grab something. And we're back to the start. And this time I'll press Control Tab to go back into object mode so we're ready for animation. Okay, so make sure you've caught up with me and that you've saved your work. Okay, so we're ready for animation. And what we'll do is have the snake rear up, strike out at something, and then go back to its reared up pose. And I'll do the first pose, and then I'll challenge you to do the rest of the animation. So I'll go to front view, and I'll bring up the timeline so we can see what we're doing. And I'll open up the side summary here. Now I'll press the record button, and I'm only going to animate the rotation of each of the bones. I'm not going to move any of them. So what we can do is under keying, I can have an active keying set here. If I select on this, I can select the rotation and then come down to the auto keyframing and only active keying set. So when I go into pose mode, and remember pose mode is where the posing and animation happens, not edit mode. I won't rotate the first bone because I want him to have some sort of base on the ground there. I'll start with the second one and rotate this around. I'll just zoom out a bit so you can see what I'm doing a little bit more easily and get rid of this side box here. And I'll speed this up about 5 times, but you can see what I'm doing. So some sort of S shape a little bit like this. Now in our summary, it's worth noting that every bone has to be keyframed. So if I select all, you can see all my bones down here. And if I select just one bone and open that up, you can see only the rotation has been keyframed because of our active keying set here. So I've keyframed the first frame and I'm going to challenge you to do the rest of the animation. But I only want you to do the striking pose and coming back to this rearing pose. I'll talk a little bit more about the animation process once you've done that. So the striking pose will reach out and strike something on the ground just here. You could even place an object there if you want, but do remember to go back to pose mode for this object. So you'll need a pose for that strike, and then you'll need to copy this pose so that the snake can go back to this position. Don't worry too much about timing at the moment. Just make sure you've got those 2 poses keyframed. Pause the video and have a go at that. Okay, so it's going to strike an object down here. I'll go across to frame 20. Again, it doesn't matter too much because we can move this keyframe later. Now I'll start moving my snake into position. And again, I'll speed this up 5 times so it doesn't bore you. And you'll probably notice with all these different bones that it is a little bit awkward to animate, but I'll talk more about how you can rig objects so it's not as complicated as this in the future. But for now, we've got that striking pose and that's being recorded. So we should see this striking action here. And we want to repeat the initial keyframe of all the bones. So remember to select all the bones, select that summary keyframe, Shift D to duplicate, and I'll move that across to frame 40. I'll reduce the length of the animation to 40 for now, and we'll see what that looks like. So it strikes out and comes back. Not looking particularly dangerous at the moment. It looks more like a dancing snake. But hopefully you got up to that point. Now, obviously it needs to strike out really fast. So we can decrease the distance between these two to increase the speed. So G to grab, move that maybe to frame 10. I'll just zoom in so we can see that a bit more easily. So let's see what that looks like. A little bit faster, but he's still a bit of a sleepy snake. So we'll go 5 frames. That's more like it. It seems much more dangerous like that. We can probably bring our snake back a little bit quicker. So 30 frames. So it strikes out and comes back and sits and rests for a moment. But one thing I would like to add is a bit of anticipation. Anticipation is where we see a sort of preliminary movement before the main movement. So if you imagine throwing a ball, you lean backwards first and then throw the ball forwards. We've already got this a little bit in the recoil here, but I'm going to select these 2 frames and I'll move them both across to, let's say, frame 10. And this first frame, I'll just duplicate it. So Shift D to duplicate. So we've got this sort of pause at the moment, but this one I want to edit slightly so it's recoiling backwards a bit. So I'll change it very slightly. So something like this. So it's got a bit of recoil, although it's overlapping itself there. So I have to be a bit careful. So I'll just move that one up very slightly and that down very slightly. And hopefully we can stop it from overlapping itself. And then we have that strike out. Let's see what that looks like. So a bit of recoil and then it strikes out. Let's see that one last time. And that's working relatively well. So your challenge then is to complete the animation of your snake. And an optional extension task of that is to render out the snake animation. We won't be using this file in the next lecture, but do save your work in case you want a reference to come back to.